In this lecture, we are going to create an API which is going to handle sign up request, which is going to come to our Node.js application. So let's go to VS Code and let me go ahead and let me close the files, which is not required for now. And let's also close this server.js file. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder in the server folder, and I'm going to call this as controllers. Okay, and inside this controllers folder, we are going to create controller files, which is going to handle incoming requests. So inside this controller folder, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it as auth controller. Inside this auth controller, we are going to create the endpoints which will handle any authentication and authorization requests like login and sign up. Now in this file, in order to create routes, we are going to import the router. So here, let's go ahead and let's create a variable. Let's call it router. And to import the router, we are going to require the express package. And on that, we are going to call this router method. So this is going to return us a router that will be assigned to this router variable. And this router variable is basically an object which is going to provide us with some method which we can use to handle different types of requests like get request, post request, patch request, delete request, etc. So here we are going to create a route which will handle a sign up request. And the sign up request is going to be a post request. So whenever a user will try to sign up to our application, he needs to send a post request with the user details. Now, in order to create that route on this router, we are going to call post method because this router is going to handle a post request. And then we also need to specify the path on which it is going to handle that post request. So that will be the first argument. So here we are going to specify the path as sign up. So whenever a user will make a request to root URL slash sign up, that request will be handled by this router. And then we also need to pass a second argument which will be executed whenever a post request comes to this route. And from here, for now, we are going to return a simple response. Now, this callback function, since it is going to handle the request, this callback function is also going to receive the request object and the response object. Okay, and from here, we are going to send a response by using response object and on that calling the send method. And what do we want to send in the response? Let's say for now we want to send this response user created successfully. Okay, let's save this file. And from here, let's also go ahead and let's export this router on which we have created this post route. So for that, let's say module.exports and we want to export the router. Let's save this file. And now we are going to call this router from our app.js file. So in the app.js file, before we are exporting this app object, before that, here we are going to call the routers from auth controller. And for that, first of all, we are going to import this router which is being exported from this auth controller. For that, again, we are going to use this require function. And here we are going to specify the path of that controller file. So from the current directory, we need to go to the controllers folder. And from there, we want to use whatever is being exported from this auth controller file. And we know that from this auth controller, we are returning a router. So let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable and let's call it auth router. You can name it anything. All right. And once we have the auth router, now here we are going to use that router. So for that, we can say app.use. And to this, first we are going to specify the path for that router. So the path is going to be, let's say, /API/auth. All right. So now the URL will be root URL /API/auth/signup for sign up requests. Let's save this. And here we also need to specify the router which we want to use for this path. So here we are going to specify the auth router. And let me make this R in caps so that we follow the camel case notation. Okay. And one more thing which we are going to do here is, so with some of the requests, we are also going to receive the request body, and that request body will be in JSON format. So once we receive that request body with the request, we want to convert that JSON data into a JavaScript object so that we can use it easily in our Express application. And for that, we are going to use a middleware, and that middleware is express.json. So when we are using this middleware, what it is going to do is it will check for the request body, and in the request body, when we will have JSON data, it will convert it to JavaScript object, and then it will pass that object to the next middleware or to the router. All right, with this, let's save the changes and let's test this router, this post router. So for that, I already have Postman open, and we are going to use Postman for testing our APIs. So if you have not installed Postman yet, then I'll highly recommend you to install Postman first, because we are going to use Postman for testing and documenting our APIs. All right, here I'm going to open this tab. Let me close this overview tab here. And here we are going to make a post request, because for the sign up request, the request type should be post. Let's specify the URL here. So our Node.js application is running on localhost port number 5000. After that, we need to specify API slash auth, because that's what we have specified here for the route. So as you can see, the route path should be slash API slash auth, and then for sign up, it is slash sign up. So let's also specify that slash sign up. Okay, and currently I'm not going to send any request body because we are not handling any request body with the post request. So let's go ahead and let's make a request, and let's see if we are receiving the response or not. And in the response, you can see that it has returned user created successfully. So our sign up route is working as expected. Now inside this sign up route, now we are going to write the actual logic for signing up the user. So let me remove this line from here. And here, let's first go ahead and let's add try catch block. So in the try block, whenever an error will occur, that will be handled by this catch block. So when an error occurs, what we want is we want to send a response. And for that, we are going to use response.send. So this send method is going to send a response. And what response do we want to send? We are going to pass an object here. In that object, we are going to specify two properties, the message property and the status property. So let's set the message property here. And for the message, we are going to send the actual error message. For that, let's say error.message. And let's also set the status property. So for the status, I'm simply going to use success here. So in this case, we will say success is false. That means some error has occurred and the user was not signed up properly. So that's why I'm sending this success as false. So this is the response we want to send whenever an error occurs in the try block of this API. All right. Now in the try block, before signing up the user, first we are going to perform some negative scenarios. So what we are going to do is, first we are going to check if the user already exists. And if the user already exists, in that case, what we are going to do is we are going to send an error response saying that user already exists. Now, if the user does not exist already, then we are going to add that user. We are going to create that user. But before creating that user, what we also want is the user is going to provide his password in a plain text. So before saving that password in the database, first we are going to encrypt that password, and then only we are going to save the encrypted password in the database. So the third step will be to encrypt the password. And finally, after encrypting the password, we are going to create the new user and we are going to save it in the database. So let's go ahead and let's implement each of these steps one by one. To check if the user already exists or not, we are going to use our user model. So we created the user model in our last lecture. So in order to use that user model, we are also going to import that user model. So for that, let's say const user equals, and we are going to require that file from where we are exporting the user model. So from the current directory, we need to go one directory up. There we have the models folder. In that models folder, we have this user model. So from this user file, we are returning the user model, and that will be assigned to this user variable. So now here we can say user.find1. And how we are going to find the user? We are going to find the user based on his email ID. So to this find one, we are going to pass this object, and there we want to search the user based on his email. So in the request body, when we are going to send a user object, in that user object, we are also going to have an email property. So we are going to read that email property from the request body. And for that, we can simply say request.body. This request.body is going to store that user object. And from that user object, we want to access the value of email property. And here, let's also use this await keyword, because all these functions are going to run asynchronously. And since these functions are going to run asynchronously, here we also need to use the async keyword. Okay, so this expression here will return that user whose email ID matches the email ID which we are going to receive in the request body. Now, if the user is found, that user will be returned. Let's go ahead and let's store it in the user variable. Okay. But if the user with that email ID is not found, in that case, this expression will return undefined. Okay. So if the user is found with that email ID, that means that user already exists, and that user will be returned and it will be assigned to this user variable. But if no user is found with that email address, that means that user does not exist in the database, and in that case, this expression will return undefined. So if the user already exists, in that case, we are going to send a response. For that, again, we are going to use response.send method, and there we are going to pass an object. In that object, we are going to set the message property, and the message will be user already exists. You can give a more meaningful message here, but I want to keep things simple, so I'll simply say user already exists. Okay, and then we are also going to set success property to false. So this is the response we want to send if the user already exists. And then we also want to immediately return from this function. So no further code should be executed in that case. We should immediately return from here. All right. Now, before we return from here, let's also check if the user already exists. So here, let's write the if statement, and there we are going to pass user. So if the user already exists, in that case, this user will store an object. That object will be a truthy value. So this condition will return true. And when this condition returns true, that means the user already exists. So in that case, we want to return this response. So I'll cut it from here and I'll paste it inside this if statement. Okay, so from here itself, we will return, and the further code which we are going to write, that will not be executed in case if the user already exists. Now, if the user does not exist with that email ID, then the next thing which we are going to do is we are going to encrypt the password which we have received in the request body. In the request body, we are going to receive a plain password. So we are going to encrypt it, and then we are going to save it in the database. Now, for password encryption and decryption, we are going to use another third-party package. So let me go ahead, let me save this file first. Let's open VS Code built-in terminal. Let me clear this terminal here. And here we are going to install bcrypt.js package. So from the npm, we are going to install bcrypt.js. Let's press enter. So that package has been installed. Now we are going to require that package. So let's create a variable. Let's call it bcrypt. And we are going to require that package using this require function. And the name of the package is bcrypt.js. All right. Now let's scroll down. And here we are going to use bcrypt dot, and on this object we have a method called hash, which we can use for hashing the password. And this method is also going to run asynchronously. So let's use await keyword here. And to this, we need to pass the value which we want to encrypt. In this case, we want to encrypt the password. So from the request body, we are going to read the password, and we want to encrypt that password. Then we are also going to specify the salt value. So the second argument here is the salt value. This value determines the computational cost of hashing. So if you specify a higher value here, then in that case, the result will be a little bit slower. So the encryption will be a little bit slower, but it will be more secure. And if you specify lower value, then the encryption will be faster, but that encrypted value might be less secure. So here let's keep it as 10, which is good enough for securing the password. So this line here, it is going to return us the encrypted password. Let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable and let's call it maybe hashed password. Okay, let's again make this P in caps. And then what we are going to do is in the request body, we have plain password. So we are going to set that password property from the request body to this encrypted password. So for that, let's say request.body.password equals this hashed password. So instead of saving the plain password, we are going to change that password value to this hashed password. And now we are going to save the object which we have in request body in the user collection of our database. For that, in the fourth step, what we are going to do is we are going to create a new user using the user model. And to that, we are going to pass request.body. And here again, we need to use await keyword. And here what I'll do is, let me close this terminal. So if you see this user variable and this user model, the name is same here. So it might be a little bit confusing. So what I'll do is I'll make it in capital. Okay. And then here we are going to use that capital user, basically the user model. And here also we are going to use that user model. So using this user model, first the user object which we are going to receive in the request body, that will be validated using the user schema. And if the validation is successful, it is going to create a user object using that user model. So let's go ahead and let's assign that user object to a variable and let's call it as new user. So here the user object from the request body has been created. Now we are going to save this new user in the database. And to save this new user in the database, on this new user, we are going to call the save method. Okay, and the save method is going to run asynchronously. So let's use the await keyword here. And if we don't have any error till this line, that means the user is created successfully and the user is also inserted in the database. So from here, we can return a response. For that, again, we are going to use response.send. And from here, we are going to send a message. And let's say the message is user created successfully. Okay. And let's also set the success to true. So whichever response we are going to send, there we are going to have this message property and this success property. And for some of the responses, we are also going to have the data property, because with some of the requests, we might also want to send the data to the client. All right. So till here, if everything is okay, that means the user has been created successfully and the user has been added in the database. So after that, we are sending this response to the client. With this, let's save this file and let's go ahead and let's test this API. So let's again go back to Postman. Here, let's go to request body. There we are going to send raw data. In here, I'm going to create an object. So the user object which we are going to send, that user object must have a first name, last name, email, and password property. So these four properties are mandatory. Let's go ahead and let's specify these properties. And here we need to specify the JSON data. Okay, so this is the user object which we are going to send with the request. But before we do that, let's also check the validation. So if I don't specify a first name here, if it is empty string, and if I try to send the request, let's see what happens. Here we get the validation error saying that first name is required. So since we have not specified the first name, that's why we have this error. So let's specify the first name. Okay, so the validation is also working. We can also test it with last name and email, but I'm not going to do that. All right, now let's send this post request to this sign up route to this sign up API with this user data. When I click on this send button, so here we can see the message user created successfully and success is true. So that means we are receiving this response. And that simply means that till here there was no error. That means the user should have also been added in the database. So let's open Compass here and there let's go to user collection and let's refresh this collection. And there you can see we have that user created. So you can see the first name is John, last name is Smith, email is johnsmith@gmail.com, and the password is first encrypted and then it has been stored in the database. So the password encryption is also happening as expected. That means our sign up route is working as expected. In the next lecture, we are going to create the login route.